Well, good morning. Please be seated. So Ian, hold on, stay up here. Ian is, you're deploying, right? You're going to Okinawa. Ian serves in our tech ministry. I don't know, what is David doing with all these magnets? Goodness. He serves in our media ministry, our tech ministry, as most important job is pulpit mover. Who are you with? Third LAR. So I know 3-7 just got back, but we just wanted to pray over Ian real quick and the rest of Third LAR as they make their way to deployment. Is that fine? I didn't tell you were doing this, but Lord, I just want to lift up Ian and the rest of Third LAR to you, Father. Lord, be with them. Anoint him as he goes on that mission, Lord. And as they hold the line on behalf of us, I ask that he desperately holds on to you. Lord, use him as he's there. Let him treat it as the real mission, Lord, is to reach people there, both within his battalion, to the Okinawans, Lord, anybody you may put in his way that he can reach with your love and your gospel, Lord. Be with him, bring him back safely to us. We pray this in your heavenly name. Amen. Amen. So before we get started, I have to say to my fellow Marine brothers and sisters, happy birthday. I'm actually surprised there's as many of you in the room today as there are. But I also want to tell, you may not know this, but Pastor David actually shares a birthday with the Marine Corps. It is his birthday today too, which is why I have the pulpit. That's how you know you're destined to pastor a Marine church, right? But I want to wish Pastor David a good, nice, happy birthday as well. But we've been in this series called Red Letter Discipleship, and the idea is we need to take what did Jesus actually say it meant to follow him and be a disciple. And what I want to do this morning is get into one of his parables. And if you know me, I actually did a Bible study on this a couple years ago. We did a whole series on parables. I absolutely love the parables of Jesus for a couple reasons. One, 2/3 of all of Jesus' teachings are parables. So if you do not know how to study and you don't understand parables, you're missing out on about 2/3 of everything Jesus ever taught. But parables are just fun. They're stories. They're meant to be fun. They're meant to be challenging, but there's the sense that in the parable itself, it's meant to be explored. That it's almost cryptic in a certain sense. And the reason for that is Jesus, understanding that the Jewish establishment had been trying to come at him for a while, and not wanting to go to his glory on the cross too soon, he would teach and really some of his more offensive or controversial sermons in parable form, because you can't crucify somebody for telling a story. Does that make sense? But the other thing is with it is that there's this sense that there's like almost a spiritual maturity or spiritual receptiveness that you need to possess to understand a parable. I like it. Do you guys ever have did you have like a song or like a movie you watched when you were little, and you watched it or you listened to it many times, and you grow up and you go back and watch that movie or listen to that song, and you're like, oh, that's what that song's really about? I just had this song, Nelly, Ride With Me. Anybody know? My generation. Jammed out to that song in middle school, and then I'm listening to it as an adult with my kids in the car, and I'm like, oh, that's what this song's really about, right? I hadn't matured yet to understand. I could hear the same words, right? But I hadn't matured enough to actually understand the song. Another one, anybody know the show Everybody Loves Raymond? So my parents, when they were my age, loved that show. And I never understood why they were so infatuated with that show. Well, they play it on TBS now. And I've been having this Everybody Loves Raymond renaissance. I'm just telling you, if you are married with kids, that show is probably the most relatable show when it comes to marriage and raising kids. I think every episode there's some situation or argument or problem that me and my wife have personally had, like to the T, right? Like dealing with the snack schedule for Little League Baseball and how over-the-top parents get, or just things like that. But I didn't appreciate it then because I hadn't matured yet. And parables kind of act in that same form, right? That you have to mature and live a little bit to also really receive and understand what he is teaching on. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them to Luke chapter 16. And as you move there, I just want to take some substantial time to kind of paint the context around this parable, of not just to understand it, but to understand why Jesus gave this parable when he did. To kind of set the context, this all starts, Jesus is essentially invited to the house of a rich Jewish leader on Sabbath day. They're going to have the Sabbath feast that he's invited to, and frankly, he kind of comes to be a little bit of a tough house guest. Anybody ever have you guys have that friend you can only invite around certain people? Like Thanksgiving's coming up, right? Like we probably all have that aunt, uncle, cousin that you're like, oh, this is especially this year, right? Election year, this is gonna be a fun Thanksgiving for some of you all in your family. But Jesus is kind of, I actually during COVID, when everything was shut down, dinner parties and things of that nature got popular, or at least more popular. And they did this survey of what are some bad behaviors of house guests that would make you essentially not invite them back. And here were the top 4. You ready? The first one was wiping your hands on the couch. I think that's just a general, that's just man. You don't do that in any house, but that's enough. That was the number one thing they said, if I see you wipe your hands on my couch, you're not invited back. Second, putting feet up on the furniture. So apparently we really love our furniture. Third, this is like an unwritten one, I think, but passing gas or going number 2. I feel like that you bear some responsibility with that. Like if you do a taco bar, I'm just saying, you can't anyways. Number 4 is very modern. It's asking for the Wi-Fi password within 30 minutes of arriving. That was number 4 on the list. So Jesus, I don't think at this dinner party was doing anything like that. I don't think he was passing gas at this Jewish leader's home. But by even modern standards, Jesus, could interpret his behavior as being one that would have been considered vastly culturally inappropriate to be a guest at somebody's house. But I think we'll understand why. We may say that he was a tough house guest, but I don't think we could say he was wrong. So to set the scene, he's invited to this Sabbath dinner at a rich ruler's house, and he's at the house, but Sabbath hasn't broken yet. And he's out there with some of the other house guests, some of which being the Jewish lawyers, the experts of the law. And this man comes up, and he needs help. He needs to be healed. And Jesus looks at the Jewish lawyers, and he asks them, is it lawful for me to heal this man on the Sabbath? And the text says, this is in Luke chapter 14, and I'm just paraphrasing all this. I'm going to try to do this rapid. I have all these broken down on the online notes, so you can go track through it if you want to go back to it later. But he looks at him, he says, is it lawful? And it says that these Jewish lawyers had no answer for him. They remained silent. So the experts of the law had no answer for Jesus of whether it was lawful to heal on the Sabbath. So Jesus heals this man, sends him on his way. And this kind of sets the tone for the rest of the night. Because after this, they end up heading inside to actually have the dinner banquet. And Jesus notices all the other guests, these prominent figures. This is a rich man's house, so all the guests that would be there wouldn't have been just normal people. Like every Jewish family would have this kind of dinner to break Sabbath, but this man being where he was, all his guests would have been prestigious, the elites, right? The businessmen, the rabbis, and of the sort. And he sees all these guests jockeying over position at the table. So in those days, everything surrounded the dinner table. This was true of the Romans. It was true of the Jews. And the closest you sat to the host meant you held the higher honor. And there was almost this assigned seating chart of honor if you were invited to a dinner party. The problem was the host would never communicate that to the guests. So all the guests are there with their own perceived value of How honorable am I compared to everybody else? And they're jockeying for position at this table. And then the host, as everybody sits down, the host would demote or promote people. He would say, hey, no. Hey, Jimmy, you come up over here. Matt, you go sit in the back, this is what they would do. And Jesus sees this, and he's seeing the lack of humility that exists within these house guests. That they're all jockeying, thinking themselves to be better than the people next to them. So he teaches them, he corrects them and tells them, in all that you do, make sure that you do it with humility. So that you start at the lowest place of honor, because it's better to be promoted in honor than demoted in shame. But then right after that, Jesus has this other irritation. He noticed that all the guests there were all the prominent figures, and none of them exist of any of the poor, none of the hungry, none of the people who really could have benefited from this man's wealth. So he ostracizes the host and tells them, when you do these, you should be inviting those people. Don't just be inviting the people that benefit you socially or politically. Be inviting them. So you can imagine at this particular time, would you all agree that's kind of rude? Right? This isn't Jesus' party. He's invited. And he starts ostracizing the guests. He embarrasses the Jewish lawyers. And then he corrects the host in his own home at his own dinner. Right? So there's some tension that has built up. One of the other guests, this is how I read it. I think this guest notices the tension and he tries to break the tension. And what he does is he blurts out this very abstract, vague, spiritual statement. What I'm saying, like those things that feel good and sound good but really mean nothing. So this guest pretty much just says, well, blessed are those who are invited to the banquet of God. And Jesus kind of looks at him, he's like, oh, you want to know about the banquet of God? Let me tell you. And then he tells the parable of the wedding feast. So Jesus is just being relentless at this dinner, right? Like probably very much they're regretting inviting him. He's as relentless because you can see the movement from this night is that right after he tells that parable, it says that he then goes out to the crowds who had followed him there. Now, to the point, this host did not invite the rest of the people who had followed Jesus to the banquet. They were on the outside. So they had followed him there, but because they weren't invited, they were outside. So it says that Jesus then moves out there and starts teaching to them. This is where you get the teachings of that you need to deny yourself, pick up your cross, follow him. You need to count the cost. You need to be purposeful and useful for God's kingdom. And then as he's teaching them, the sinners and the sinners and the tax collectors within the group come forward and he's conversing with them. So you get this sense, and I just want you to understand what Jesus did. That's actually a pretty dramatic move. Because for Jesus to be at that party, to give his time there is to share his honor with that host. And what he's essentially saying is you didn't invite them into the banquet because they couldn't benefit you in any way. I'm going to be here and still give you my time and therefore my honor, but I'm going to share that time and honor with them out there. So he moves outside the banquet hall to the crowd. He's talking with these tax collectors, and the Pharisees are absolutely just steaming. They're saying, who is this man who's conversing with them? But then it says, and also is eating with them. So that suggests kind of like one of three options. Jesus took his plate and went out to eat with the crowd, or he invited the crowd or those tax collectors into the banquet with him. And the Pharisees are there like, what are you doing? Right? So now he's maybe inviting other people into this rich man's home. And the Pharisees are just seething that he's even talking to these tax collectors. So that's when Jesus gives what we call a three-strand parable. A three-strand parable is like three different stories to the same point. He tells the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and then the parable of the prodigal son. I think you guys are familiar with at least one or two of those, right? So it's at this point, then, that the parable we're going to hit comes into play. And I just want you to kind of notice the emotional context of this environment now. The host is frustrated. The guests are probably pretty frustrated with him. But Jesus is very frustrated. Because to start the night, the Jewish lawyers, the experts of the law, somehow had missed that the greatest commandment of the law, the point of the law, was to love God and to love people. And you couldn't answer a basic question about healing on the Sabbath, and you're the experts. And then he sees all the other religious elite, all the other guests jockeying in their arrogance for position at the table, and that they had completely forgot what the prophet Micah said, that the only thing you can offer God is to walk humbly with him. And they're not walking humbly. Then he looks at this Jewish leader and sees their lack of generosity and compassion for the poor. You see how he's starting to get frustrated himself? And then the Pharisees, who are supposed to be the reformed movement within Judaism, who are supposed to be bringing Israel back to God, have completely given up on the lost people. So it's at this moment that Jesus looks at the last demographic of the people who were at that party, which were his disciples. Okay? So this is a parable to his disciples in that context, understanding that everybody's listening to what he's about to teach, but it's to his disciples. Okay? And I just kind of think about the disciples for a second, because those guys are like, they're fishermen, they're blue collar. They have probably never been to a banquet like this in their life. And the way you see Jesus acting, they probably have some like secondhand embarrassment. Like, man, can we just enjoy the party, right? But then after all this, Jesus looks at his disciples and he gives this parable. So we ready? Luke 16, we're going to start in verse 1. So it says, he turned and said to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be my manager. Now let's just kind of pause there, because there's actually about, I would say, 4 very difficult truths that just in those 2 verses, Jesus communicates to us. Okay? Who do you think Jesus is referring to as both the master and the managers? Okay? And this is really easy, right? The master is God, right? Who were the managers? Who were entrusted to handle the work and the resources of the master, who was God? The priests, the Pharisees, the rabbis, the Jewish leaders, right? We all tracking? But parable isn't being taught to them. This is being taught to his disciples. So he's really setting them up that you guys have mismanaged what God has given you. You've completely mismanaged this, and you're going to turn in your account. You are fired. And he's saying this now to his disciples. Why? Because who do you think is now going to take responsibility of that management? You all. Me. His disciples. Right? So in one sense, he's giving them a promotion. He is promoting the disciples to the place. These fishermen, right? These blue-collar guys are now being promoted to the responsibility that these rich elites have. But it's also not just a promotion. He's also giving them a warning. Because if God is willing to fire them, don't think that you are safe from being fired as well. Does that make sense? So what are the 4 hard truths, though, that he gives here? Well, the first I would say this, is we need to understand that if we are a disciple of Jesus, that we are all managers. That we have all been entrusted with resources for God's kingdom. What exactly have we been entrusted with? It goes from everything from material possessions, so your money. It goes to your time, your energy. It goes to, it plays into the decisions and the positions that you publicly hold. It goes into the energy you expend, your talents, your intellect, all those things that God has entrusted to you for his glory. You are managers of his gospel. And everything that has come behind it, you are a manager of. And so we need to understand that as he's telling the story about this unfaithful manager, and if we are to be managers of his resources, we should be paying attention. Amen? We should be paying attention. Because it's not just that we are all managers, but like the old manager, we all must give account. Second hard truth, we all must give account. This is just a general principle, whether you're a disciple or not. We as Americans don't really like this idea, but we will have to give account to how we spend our money and what we don't spend our money on. We will have to give account to how we spend our time. We will have to give account of how we expend the energy we have in a day. You may feel like, well, I don't have a whole lot of money. That's maybe something that, that's a message for Elon Musk, right? But the great equalizer is time, right? Elon Musk and you have the same hours in a day. That's the great equalizer. How do you spend your time? We will all give account. I feel like I've just noticed this through ministry, but people kind of go through these different seasons, right? When you're younger, you don't have a lot of money, but you have all the time and all the energy in the world, right? So what you'll see is that younger people tend to have a harder time with the idea of tithing and giving money to the kingdom because they don't have a lot of it, right? You kind of grow, you mature, get a little more established in your career, you start making money, but then you get kids and a family. So you start having money. Money's not really the problem. And you're still young enough. You have a lot of energy. The problem that kind of creeps in is time, right? Taking kids to all the extracurriculars, right? You got dance and gymnastics and jujitsu and baseball. And then there's Awana. And then plus the laundry packs up because the family's getting big and they're all in the house. And cooking and shopping and all those things can start taking your time very quickly. So we struggle to give God time. But then you get into this season of life where the kids are out of the house. You've had this lifetime of building wealth. You have all the time in the world. I wouldn't say you have all the money in the world, but you have money. But then your energy starts to kind of dwindle a bit, right? So then you're having a hard time. Okay, well, I'm no problem giving my time or my money. I just don't have a lot of energy. But the reality is this, is that whatever season you're in, you will have to give account to how you managed those resources. Whatever season you're in, we will all have to give account to how we handled those resources. So the second hard truth, we will give account, but not just that we will give account, but here's the third one. We will give account to God alone. Notice that how in this parable, it says that accusations had been given, were given against this manager. Now, this manager doesn't then go and have to give account to his accusers. He ultimately has to go give account to who? The master. And I think this is a really important point, and particularly within our culture, because I think many people, I taught a Bible study not too long ago, took a position on something that I think is a moral issue that has become a pretty hot topic, cultural and political issue. And somebody in the group, in the Bible study group, believed my position to be unchristian, and that their position was the Christian position. I obviously disagreed, and they spent weeks trying to change my mind, right? Weeks. Now, question for you. Let's say they were successful in changing my mind. Does that matter at all? Because ultimately, nobody gives account to me. You're not going to be standing before me on Judgment Day, right? What ultimately matters isn't whether your excuses or your reasons for the positions you hold, how you spent your time or how you spent your money, if it's enough to satisfy a pastor or your spouse or your boss or anybody else in the church, what ultimately matters, will that excuse pass the litmus test when you give your account to Jesus? Right? I get it. Like, there was, when I was a Awana commander, young family, they're like, we really want to get involved in the church, and we're just having a hard time. I'm like, well, hey, I really need a lot of help on Wednesday nights with Awana. They're like, yeah, that'd be great. The problem is, we just got soccer, and I got this book club on Wednesdays, but then Thursdays, we got bowling, and it's just, we're just so busy, don't have the time. And I said, okay. Like, I'm not going to validate that. You don't give account to me. The question is, you giving that reason that bowling took up your time to where you couldn't serve God, is that going to pass the litmus test when you give account to Jesus? It applies to everything. Pastor David, who's up here preaching every Sunday, we have church structure and accountability for good reason. Jesus made his church that way. But ultimately, if David preaches a sermon you don't like, on a topic you don't like, or in a manner you don't like, he ultimately doesn't give account to you. Everything he does at this pulpit, he has to give account to Jesus of how he properly manages what he's been entrusted to with this pulpit. Does that make sense? That is true for anybody where we are. We ultimately give account to God alone. But the fourth hard truth that is right here in these first two verses is this, is that we are all guilty of mismanagement. If we are honest with ourselves, and you honestly look at your life and your priorities and what you have committed your resources to, I think every single person in this room, if they're honest with themselves, would say we are guilty of mismanaging what God has entrusted to us. Kids, parents, can you honestly look at the way you've been managing your household and say, this was my best? Right? Can you look at the way you've been spending money and say, yep, I've given enough. I've given enough to God, I've given enough to the poor. May pay that $900 truck bill and put $2,000 in the lift kit and all that, but I gave that $5 at that guy at McDonald's. I think if we're honest with ourselves, every single one of us would recognize we are guilty of mismanaging what God has entrusted to us. Now, I want you to read, let's see, verse 3 here. So in light of this, the manager says to himself, well, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. And many of you, if you've been listening at all up to this point, may be feeling that kind of same stress or tension. I don't know, I felt an anxiety just reading and preparing for this message. Is anybody feeling the same tension right now of, well, I have mismanaged, I am guilty, what does that mean? What shall I do? And I just want to remind you of something. One of the last words Jesus said on the cross, when he was hanging on that cross with his dying breath, he pulled himself up and he shouted the word tetelestai. And it's a Greek word, it's a legal term, but more specifically, it's a legal business term. It can mean different things in different contexts, but it generally means this: debt paid, paid in full, contract complete, or accounts settled. Okay, here's the idea, okay? And I just want to kind of alleviate maybe some of your anxiety right now. If you believe Jesus was the promised solution of God to handle the sin problem, and you recognize that in your sin you have mismanaged, that you are guilty of mismanaging what God has entrusted to you, but you believe Jesus is that solution, Jesus says to you, I have settled your account. It has been forgiven. Accounts are settled. But why are we even talking about it? Well, two things. One, this isn't the point of the parable. This is just the foundation for it. Okay? This is the starting point. This is where all Christianity starts. This is where repentance starts. This is where everything that is based in the gospel starts. You recognizing that you are guilty of mismanagement. But then there's a second piece to it. If you recognize that you are guilty, that you have mismanaged what God has entrusted to you, but you also recognize that Jesus is the answer, there's this sense then that you don't continue on mismanaging God's account. Does that make sense? You do not look in your reverence, in your fear, but ultimately your gratitude. You do not continue on mismanaging God's resources after you realize you're guilty of mismanagement, but that he has forgiven it, that he settled the account for you. But this is just the foundation for it. Let's keep reading. Verse 4. This is what he says. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. Now, you understand what he's doing right here. What he's essentially saying is that I recognize in my guilt that I've mismanaged what my master has entrusted to me. I recognize that I'm going to have to go give account for it, but in the meantime, I'm going to use a little bit of influence, power that I have left to set myself up for the future. So he's essentially going around and saying, if you owe 100, pay off that debt, 50% on the dollar, right? It's a pretty good deal. The idea is that he's making friends for himself so that when he gets fired, he'll have enough friends who will welcome him in, maybe give him provisions, give him a place to sleep. He is setting himself up for the future. Now, notice what Jesus or what the master in the story says, because this is kind of shocking. Would we all agree that up to this point that this manager isn't probably like the best guy, right? I think that's the sense we're supposed to get. But then notice what it says in verse 8. But the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. Isn't that interesting? He is commended for his shrewdness. Why was this manager commended? What was he so shrewd on? Well, I really just wrote two things. The first one I would say this, is the manager, in recognizing he was guilty, recognizing he was going to give account to his master, the manager did not wait, but acted urgently now. He used the information he had, and he acted on it now. He didn't sit in stress and anxiety and just kind of wait for the day of accountability to come, but he used what he knew and he acted now. Now, I would say this, if you are somebody this morning, maybe you have not, maybe you're not, you don't consider yourself a disciple of Jesus yet. Maybe you're part of that crowd that Jesus refers to earlier on in in Luke chapter 14, who you're still counting the cost, right? I'll just say this, everything after this point of this sermon is not for you, because the rest of this is for his disciples. But the message for you this morning is this piece right here, is that if you are honest with yourself, do you honestly think that you are your highest sense of accountability in your life? Do you think that you yourself, that there's not going to be a point where you have to go give account to somebody or something outside of yourself? Are you it? And if you're honest with yourself and you say, no, I do think that there is something beyond me that I will have to bear account to, the way I behave, the way I talk, what I look at. If you know that, what are you going to do about that now? And I'm not saying that you need to come, if you're still counting the cost, keep counting the cost. It's important to do that. But you can't just sit there now in that anxiety of knowing that fact and not explore of who you're going to actually go give that account to. Use that information now. And that is one thing that this manager did. He acted with urgency now with the information that he had. People often say that, the world doesn't exist in this. We don't live as if we're going to be held accountable anymore. I actually disagree with that. I think people live their life to the highest form of accountability in their life. So if God's not your highest form of accountability, then who or what is? Right? For some of you, it may be just your spouse. You may only be at church because you have to give account to your spouse later. You know what I'm saying? Some of you, it's your boss. We just had an election. Elections generally are meant to be almost like a day of accountability, right? Turn in your accounts. We're going to hold our leaders to account to the way they have managed and handled what we've entrusted with them, right? Obviously, Donald Trump was just elected because we said we did not think you handled and managed what we entrusted you with in the Biden administration. The whole reason the Biden administration was there is because we then said we didn't think that the way Donald Trump handled what we entrusted him with worked, right? And then Trump was there the first time because we said Barack Obama didn't handle it. You see what I'm saying? But for them, their highest form of accountability is us, right? who is the highest form of accountability in your life? If it's not Jesus, is it yourself? Are you the God? Are you the God of your life? But he used what he knew and acted urgently now. But then second, he did this, is that he wisely prioritized relationships over immediate wealth. So this manager could have used that time just to try to embezzle as much resources as he could to set him up so that he had at least some sort of nest egg that when he got fired, he could go to. Instead, what he prioritized was building relationships with people that was longer lasting. And that's what Jesus is saying this master commended. He doesn't commend that he was good. He commended him for being shrewd. Does that make sense? He commended him for being shrewd. There's also this sense that as this manager is making these relationships and making these dealings and essentially making these compromises on behalf of his master's resources, that it kind of ties to what these Jewish elite were doing. Is that they were making these compromises with what God had entrusted to them, with Rome and with all these people, really just to set themselves up better, right? But then notice what Jesus says, because all that is building to this point. Let's keep reading verse 8. So the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So essentially what Jesus is saying is that people who belong to this world are more creative, they're more passionate, they're more zealous for pushing their thing than people who belong to the light are at pushing the light into the darkness. I think there's really 3 points Jesus is making in this parable. The first thing, and maybe you've never been told this, what does it mean to follow Jesus and be a disciple? It requires you to be creative for his kingdom. That we don't follow some cookie-cutter model of Christianity or cookie-cutter model of church or cookie-cutter model of doing ministry or youth or Awana, but that we are creative in reaching the people we want to reach. I just brought up the election. Can I just say this about the election? I've seen people on both sides in the church. I've seen this one side celebrate as if Christ just ascended his throne. And I see this other group mourn as if he just stepped down from it. Christ is king yesterday, today, and forever. Nothing's changed there. But wouldn't it be great to see people campaign for Jesus the way you saw them campaign for their politicians over the last year? Be as creative, be as passionate. Wouldn't that be amazing? Where do you think we would be? Where would the gospel be now? Here's another good example for you. Do you know Coca-Cola has reached 90% of the world? So it is the second most known name across the world, next to OK. Do you all know that? Coca-Cola, 90% of the world has heard of Coca-Cola. They've seen it, they know Coca-Cola. You know what they say the projections are for people in the world who have heard the gospel? The most liberal estimate, 60 to 70%. That means Coca-Cola has been more zealous and creative at getting the brand Coke soda across the world more so than the church. Think about that. Because the sons of this world are more shrewd than the sons of light. We need to be creative. You may have somebody in your life right now that you've just given up because that cookie cutter model didn't work. You're like, they're lost, right? Move on to the next. Or maybe you're not being creative enough. Marines, you know this in terms of leadership, right? You can't lead every Marine the exact same way, right? You can't lead every Marine the same way. They don't respond the same way. You have to know everyone individually and approach them their way to lead them properly. It is no different when you're sharing the gospel. You have to be creative for his kingdom. The second thing I think Jesus is telling us is this, that we need to stay focused and take our management seriously. The problem with Jesus' generation and the religious elite then is that they had lost focus of what the point was, and they stopped taking what had been entrusted to them spiritually seriously. I know this kind of like sermon can be kind of heavy, right? I I don't want you to miss the beauty in this, though, okay? If I have to give account for every second of every minute of every day, if I have to give account for every penny of every dollar I ever earn, if I have to give account for every calorie that I certainly probably overconsume in a given day, if I have to give account for every one of those, then that means every second of every minute of every day, every penny of every dollar that I earn can be filled with incredible purpose and meaning. That every calorie, every penny, every second matters. I don't miss that beauty, right? It all matters. But thirdly, I would say this. I think Jesus is saying this ultimately, and we see this wrapped up in verse 9. He says, "So I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings." In other words, use your material resources to the benefit of others. Because your wealth may not even survive this life, let alone the next. But you take what you materially have now, and not just material, all the resources God has entrusted to you, and you use it to the benefit of others. You're making eternal investments to people when you give them your time, when you give them your energy, when you give them your money. That you don't use it just to hoard for yourself and to do your own self-advancement, but that you actually use that to the benefit of other people. The Jewish leadership and their management did the exact opposite. They took God's law and they started adding more to it. They started chaining and enslaving people more. They started indebting them more in the law, not less. And those same leaders were getting rich as they were doing this, but they were only benefiting the other rich elites, not the poor. Right? Jesus says, people will mistake this verse to mean Jesus is telling me I need to go get rich. That's what he wants. He wants me to go get rich. Like that's just prosperity gospel mumbo jumbo, right? Like that's not what he's saying. He's also not teaching that it's wrong to have money. What he's saying is that whatever resources you possess, use to the benefit of others. On the spiritual front, you receive grace, mercy, and forgiveness. Are you going to hoard that wealth, that spiritual wealth to yourself? Or are you going to pass on that mercy, grace, and forgiveness to others? Are you going to receive this incredible forgiveness of God settling your account on the cross, but then when somebody offends you, you're going to hold a grudge against them for decades? Or are you going to share that resource of grace with them? Does that make sense? So, praise team, go ahead and head on up. This is what I just want you to kind of reflect on. First, I would ask you to manage the next 5 to 7 minutes well. You are free to leave and go catch, the end of the football game if you want. You don't give account to me. But what I want to ask you is to really just reflect on this and really just ask yourself this question. If you were God and he was looking at you, how you've managed his resources, would you give yourself a raise? Would you fire yourself? What would you say if you were God and you looked at the way you manage his resources? What kind of manager would you be? I think the first step to becoming more like Jesus in this story is to recognize that we're more like the Pharisees in this story. We always like to read ourselves in to be the good guys, right? I think the first step to being more like Jesus in this story is to realize that we're like the house guests, more so than we would probably be comfortable with. So what I want to do is offer you the opportunity to come forward and come settle your account. Come settle your account with Jesus right here at the altar. Whether that is to become a disciple, to make that decision, or you've realized that, no, I am a disciple, but I've just been a bad manager up to this point. Come settle your account now.